smartphones. Technology has become an integral part of our lives, and every day we leave behind a detailed digital footprint that says a lot about who we are, from our shopping habits to our travels to our interactions with others, etc. Would you want this information to get accessed by anyone else but yourself? I'm sure you don't want. But what if this information could lead to the rescue of someone's life? What if private data held in someone's phone could help dismantle a trafficking ring? Would security take precedence over privacy on this occasion? Or is it privacy the ultimate commodity no matter what? The tension between technology companies and law enforcement has never been as high as now. This issue of discontent is encryption. The technology that gives users total discretion and prevents anyone, including law enforcement, to track communications and personal data stored in locked devices. Now, let's watch a short video to illustrate this debate, and I will introduce the speakers. This is done by the journalist team of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I will quickly introduce the two speakers, and they are great, and I have heard both of them defend their view in different manners, and I'm very curious to see what they will discuss today. Cyrus is an old friend of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. In 2013, we co-hosted together a financial working group to make work together the biggest US financial institution with anti-slavery NGOs on the issue of human trafficking. The Manastan District Attorney report on smartphone encryption and public safety, which you will hear about from Cyrus, is a fascinating example of the challenge encountered by the authorities in their effort to fight crime with tools and technology that are up to date. Ken Roth is one of the most respected and authoritative human rights campaigners. He is the executive director of Human Rights Watch, one of the world's leading international human rights organizations, which operates in more than 90 countries. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch in 1987, Ken served as a federal prosecutor in New York, so he can understand Cyrus Vance. And I think it will be interesting. He has written extensively on a wide range of human rights abuses, devoting special attention to issues of counterterrorism. Moderating the discussion will be Belinda Goldsmith, who is editor-in-chief of the team of journalists at the Foundation, and she has under her leadership 45 staff journalists and 200 freelancers. So please come on stage.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Monique. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to be moderating this discussion this afternoon with Cyrus and with Ken. This debate, of course, comes at a fascinating time with the expansion of cyberspace, and with everyone today, including most of us in this room, living on our smartphones. And of course, that includes all criminals around the world as well, though. Just a bit of background. 3 years ago, Apple and Google announced their next mobile operation systems would encrypt users' data by default. What this meant was the companies themselves could not access those iPhones. This focus on privacy came after that big scandal we all remember of naked photos of celebrities being hacked online. But overnight, this made it more difficult for private information to be hacked. It also made it more difficult for law enforcement agencies to get hold of the information on smartphones that could be used in prosecutions for crimes ranging from terrorism to human trafficking. Last year, the Facebook-owned app WhatsApp, which is now used by more than 1 billion people around the world, turned on end-to-end encryption by default. This means only the person sending the message and only the person receiving the message can see what's been sent. Encrypted smartphones and messaging have already put the authorities and some companies up against each other. The FBI last year demanded that Apple allowed it to break into a locked iPhone used by one of the people in the San Bernardino attacks, in which 14 people were killed. Apple said no, it couldn't do it, but also it wouldn't do it because this was breaking its assurance to customers of a foolproof technology. In the end, the FBI paid an unidentified third party over $1 million to unlock that iPhone. Last month in the UK Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, she asked for the police and intelligence agencies to be given access to WhatsApp because it was believed that Khalid Massoud, the man who drove over Westminster Bridge, mowing down pedestrians, 4 of whom died, and stabbed to death a police officer, had been using that messaging system before he did that. The police wanted to find out if contacts on his phone could give them some indication of the conspiracy behind this. But WhatsApp said, we can't do anything about it. So, encrypting technology, does it protect privacy? Or does it endanger the public by blocking law enforcement agencies to information? Or can you have both? So I'd like to ask Ken and Cyrus if they could speak maybe for 5 minutes each on this and their work on this, have a few questions, and then open the floor up as well, because I'm sure lots of you have some questions you'd like to put to Ken and to Cyrus. Cyrus, would you like to start?
Yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you for including me, Ken. So nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
And thank you all for coming to this debate and program. And as always, I thank Monique for the phenomenal work that you have done with Trust Women, and we've been privileged to be a part of. And to recognize also the survivors in the audience, how incredibly important it is for those of us who simply don't know the truth about it to experience it and to understand it better through your stories. So thank you for the bravery of sharing them, because it really matters to us. So in answer to your question, can you have privacy and public safety? The answer is I think you can have both. I don't think they are mutually exclusive. Up until the fall of 2014, as you said, law enforcement was able to access the contents, I don't have my cell phone, but the contents of a phone. First, in every case, we in state and local law enforcement have to go get a warrant from a judge, which means that before we make any effort to access the device, we have to actually present our evidence to a judge, saying we have probable cause to believe there is evidence of the following crimes in this device, and here's the probable cause, and the judge then makes a decision. If the judge issues a warrant, then it is an independent third party, member of the judiciary, who has agreed that there is likely to be evidence of a crime on this phone. And then we would send that order, signed by the judge, in a FedEx envelope to Apple in Cupertino, along with the cell phone at issue. And Apple would open the phone because Apple maintained what's called a key. There are probably many other words to describe it, but it had essentially the code to open its own phones. And operating like that, I've always felt that it really reflects the fair balance of public safety and privacy that's contemplated by the Fourth Amendment. Historically in our country, many of you know this, there is no zone, or there has never been before, where no one can access information, and particularly to withhold it even when a judge has issued an order saying evidence is on this device and should be opened. So we never really experienced this before. So when Apple made this change, I immediately knew this was going to be significant to law enforcement. Now fast forward 2.5 years, We have 533 devices in our cyber lab where we do forensic work, where a court has ordered the devices to be opened, but they cannot be because Apple can no longer open them. And those devices, and I hope you will pick up a copy of this report in blue that's out front. It reflects everything that I'm saying here. And those devices relate to cases involving terrorism financing, murder, rape, robbery, identity theft, and the like. So the takeaway from the decision by Apple and Google is that it has, in some cases very significantly, adversely affected our ability to solve cases and, I would say, to get justice for the victims of those cases. Apple has thus far, and Google, really refused to engage in a compromise to find a solution. And so we are at loggerheads. And I think it's unfortunate. In every situation where companies have built services or provided services that were integral to the way we live our lives, those businesses have had to adapt to the recognition that criminals take advantage of these services and devices just like you and I do. And whether it was, for example, the telephone companies when we moved from fiber optics we moved from copper wires to cables in 1994, whatever it was, the telephone companies didn't want to give law enforcement access to the new fiber cables. But Congress understood that telephones were being used by criminals to commit crimes and plot many kinds of crimes. And so Congress concluded that government with a warrant should be able to access those lines in order to protect the public. The same applies to banks. Banks, we all know, have been used by criminals to move money laundering and the like. And at a certain point in time, Congress said, well, listen, we got to start tracking the movement of cash. So we're going to require the filing of currency transaction reports when anyone comes in and moves $10,000 more cash. Now, the banks didn't want to do that, but it was obvious that criminals are using the banks and moving cash, and therefore the government said we have to find a way to balance the bank's ability to do their job with the responsibility to protect the public. So, in short, I think it's unfortunate we are at the far ends of the spectrum that we are. I think as legislature has done in many other instances, two of which I've described, there really has to be some way where both privacy and public safety can exist, and where evidence exists and is on a device that government should be able to access it. That's part of the contract I think we make in living in a society. We want our privacy, but we also want to make sure that where criminals are involved, that there's going to be a way to solve the crimes that affect our citizenry. So I think there is a way forward. I think it is through federal legislation. And I think, Ken and I, we haven't debated this before, but I expect that we probably agree on more things than we disagree on when it's all said and done. But we do, in closing, have to understand that criminals use cell phones just like you and I do. And when criminals know that the access to their phones cannot be accessed by anybody, including the government, even with a court-ordered warrant, that is a boon to criminals and at a cost to our country and victims of serious crimes that when we took my oath to take the job, I was sworn that's who I'm supposed to be working for. And that's who I am working for, and that's why I think we have to balance this concept of public safety and privacy.
Thank you. Ken.
All right. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Monique, thank you for having me. It's good to work with you again. And I'm very happy that the focus of this whole forum today is so important. Fighting trafficking is a huge priority of Human Rights Watch, and we've worked on this in dozens of countries around the world, including our own. And so I'm very happy that we're getting an entire day devoted to the topic. Let me, though, with that aside, take issue with the way this is even presented, because I don't think we should be talking about privacy versus security. We should be talking about two different routes to security. And we should decide, which is the one that makes us more secure. Now Cyrus is, as any good prosecutor, wants to get all the evidence. That's your job. Life never makes that possible. Going back in history, there are always ways to fight surveillance. I'll show you one right now. I can whisper. and short of, Belinda and I could both assert our Fifth Amendment right, and you couldn't compel us to describe what happened. Or, to fight physical surveillance. I could pull down the shades in my house. And we don't say you should outlaw shades. So there always are types of evidence that prosecutors can't get to because we respect the fact that, we do have a right of privacy. Now, as Monique mentioned in her introduction, I used to be a prosecutor. Now, I worked back in the troglodyte days. And I just look at the tools available to Cyrus today and I drool. Because, back then, if I wanted to do surveillance, I had basically three choices. I could tap somebody's phone, I could put a bug in their room, or I could follow them. And I did all three of those. But the idea that I could figure out every single person they called or every single person they emailed or put together their entire contact list or figure out because of this tracking device called our phone every place I went, just unimaginable. And you can do all of that today without decrypting this. Because the so-called metadata, that is the information about who I call or whom I email, is never encrypted. Because if it was encrypted, the intricacies of the system wouldn't know where to send the email or send the phone call. So that's just there. Much of what's on this device is also in the so-called cloud. Because if I lose this, I want to be able to capture the data. I don't want it all disappeared. So, I've made a choice that even though this is not only encrypted, I actually double encrypt this. I don't even trust Apple with my regular stuff. I encrypt it before I give it to Apple. But, I'm a little strange in that respect. I've got the Chinese government after me and things like that. But it is, but that said, I don't want to lose it all if I'm held up. So, it isn't all on the cloud. So even without forcing a backdoor into this device, there is a lot of information out there. Information that I would have loved to have when I was a prosecutor. So, many people, there's a common phrase in this term that we are sort of in, this is the golden age of information. There's just so much information out there to prosecutors. Cyrus, as a good prosecutor, wants to get a little bit more. I don't blame him. But what are the costs? Now, I've read a few things that you've written, and there are a couple compelling cases of the murder victim who may have just photographed her murderer before she was killed. And there's some great cases out there, but we should always be careful. There's something I learned in law school. The hard cases make bad law, and you've got to sort of look at the generalities. What would happen if we created a backdoor? Because this whole idea of creating a key escrow account that Apple or Google will have so they can get into my device. If you essentially introduce a vulnerability into this so that the company can get at it, there are reams of hackers out there, criminal and governmental, who will do everything they can to exploit that vulnerability. And they're going to win. We've seen this over and over again. When you introduce a vulnerability, people find it. So that means that, yes, there are a handful of crimes that may well be solved if you could have gotten into this phone. But think about the crimes that will be committed because you can get into the phone. And, all my banking information is in here. Who knows? I may have very personal stuff in here. I may be seeing a psychiatrist. I may be on HIV treatment. There are lots of things that I have very legitimate reasons not to want out there, which would suddenly become vulnerable to hacking. The other thing that is often not talked about is that one of the biggest physical crimes, forget the electronic world, physical crimes are robbing me for this thing. In 2013, there were 3 million smartphones stolen, often through robberies, that is, often through violence. And so, for every murder case here or there that you may solve, you're creating violence by providing an incentive to take my phone. Because if there is that vulnerability, the criminals will be able to exploit it. If it's fully encrypted, the phone is much less valuable, which is one of the reasons why phone thefts have gone down so much since this encryption has been introduced. Now, there's a lot of faith put in the brilliance of all these scientists in Silicon Valley. Can't these technologists come up with an answer? But what we found is that when there is a vulnerability introduced, it's exploited. Just less than a year ago, a few months ago, Yahoo, one of the big companies, was hacked for millions of email passwords. Their effective escrow key was hacked. RSA, one of the security companies, one of the experts in guarding our electronic security, it was hacked. And Lockheed Martin was then targeted, probably by a government in that case. Remember when TSA had TSA proof or TSA kind of vulnerable luggage, or so you could lock your luggage, but only TSA would have a unique key to open it up in case something untoward was happening as you were getting on the plane? That was hacked. And the generic key was put on the internet so everybody could get to it. So what we've seen is that there is no such thing as a safe vulnerability. Indeed, there is a world out there today that is looking for these vulnerabilities because they're very valuable financially. And there's a cat and mouse game with the hackers trying to find the vulnerabilities and the companies trying to band-aid them. And the last thing we need is to give the hackers a big advantage. And for these reasons, when you look around, almost every official who has spoken on this issue has said we don't want to introduce backdoor vulnerability. This has been the case for the heads of the CIA, the heads of NSA, the heads of Homeland Security. It was the case of Obama's special commission that was devoted to this. They all said that, yes, there are some law enforcement advantages if we can introduce this vulnerability into our iPhones, but there are big, big problems. And for that reason, what they have stressed is that rather than have this debate, we should be talking about the ways to improve our security consistent with our privacy. We should be, for example, rather than having this debate about, should we introduce a backdoor into my iPhone, we should be talking about why do most law enforcement officials not have Cyrus's sophistication in going after the gobs of evidence that are out there already? Why don't most law enforcement people know that they can track where their suspect went by just tracking their phone? Why don't they know about the importance of access to metadata? Why don't they know about the fact that, internationally much of this data is available even if it's not available in the United States because everybody's hacking non-nationals of their country? So, there's a lot that could be done to enhance our security through instruction to law enforcement officials rather than just introducing this backdoor that's going to make us vulnerable. Final point, even if the US were to pass legislation to say that any US manufacturer has to introduce a backdoor, would that make any difference? The stuff on here, in addition to what Apple gave me, I've put on WhatsApp. I put on Signal. Just this morning, I was using WhatsApp to deal with the Syrian chemical weapon issue, including information here from doctors in Syria who I don't want Assad to know about because they're going to get killed. I use Signal all the time because I know that has end-to-end encryption and it can't be hacked. This kind of encrypting, end-to-end encryption, is widely available. It's not a big deal anymore. So even if it's not included in the phone, anybody who's really worried about their privacy can get it. What that leaves is the dumb criminals. And we want to prosecute the dumb criminals, but we shouldn't talk about the sophisticated terrorists. Those are not the ones you're going to get. ISIS has published a long list of encryption tools that have nothing to do with US manufacturers, that are available even if the US were to enact legislation forcing a backdoor. But what the backdoor would do would be to kill Google and kill Apple, because who's going to buy a phone that the US government can tap into? You can imagine how that's going to play in the global marketplace. So And we shouldn't only be thinking about what the US would do with this, because remember, in this country, we do need a search warrant. Cyrus can't just take my phone. He would need a judge order. But a lot of countries don't operate that way. And we've seen with the Snowden disclosures that once everybody realized what NSA was doing, they started doing the same thing. You can imagine if the US government says you need a backdoor to your phone, Russia and China the next day would do the same thing. They're not going to bother waiting for that search warrant. They're going to go after their dissidents. They're going to go after the Uyghurs or the Tibetans or whoever it is they don't like. And the world is going to be a much less safe place as a result.
Thank you. Okay, great. Well, let's just kick off by asking both of you, who should be responsible for this? Should it be legislation? Should it be Congress? Should there be legislation about encryption? Or should it be the companies themselves? Where does the responsibility lie? Sorry.
It's not going to be the companies themselves. In the last 2.5 years, I think the companies have really not moved an inch off their position they took when they moved to what is called full default device encryption. So I think that it would be ideal if there was discussion between law enforcement and the companies, but I don't think that is likely to happen. So my view is we really do need to look to our congressional legislators to try to find the balance that the companies and others can't find. But may I just respond to a couple of things that Ken talked about?
Well, should we just ask Ken first of all on legislation? Should it be legislation?
Well, I mean, I'm happy if Congress ultimately legislates in this area. I don't think they want to touch it. I think they actually are happy with the status quo, which is part of why even in a completely Republican-controlled legislative environment, nothing's moving. If Congress were to act, the courts would review it to see if appropriate safeguards of privacy rights were provided. But there have been hearings on this in Congress. It's not as if this is something people are just discovering. And Congress has not acted yet because I think they actually realize that the status quo is the best solution at this point.
Right. Of course, Ken mentioned, he said metadata. It's out there already. The law enforcement agencies have access to or could get access to that. Is that right?
Well, it is absolutely true. But I think we need to look at some of Ken's words and understand what that means. Backdoor. I don't want a backdoor. I've never had a backdoor. The FBI has not had a backdoor. Historically, Apple opened devices by itself using its own technology and key that was kept in Cupertino in the secret double vault somewhere in the basement. So it has never been a backdoor, but it is very easy for people to describe it as a backdoor when it was really all in the control and hands of Apple itself. Metadata. Metadata, as Ken said, is of course very useful because it does describe what numbers called, how long that call took place, and the like. But it doesn't access the communications themselves that are reflected between the start of that call and the end of that call. And that's where usually the most powerful evidence resides. It's the talk about the attack that's going to happen. It's the talk about who we're going to target for identity theft and cyber theft. And so metadata is useful, but it's really not the solution. And I think we need to make this I think we should be honest about this from a victim's perspective. I've never met a victim yet in 10 years as DA who wanted me to have less information in order to identify who their attacker was or who the criminal was that committed whatever crime it was. There's no parent of a lost child who says, I don't want to be able to open my daughter's phone so I can find out who texted her before we lost touch with her. Now, those are dramatic, and I may be accused by Ken of being dramatic, but the truth of the matter is that it's easy to say you shouldn't get access to this information and you should use other methods of investigation that Ken feels are suitable. But when you talk to the victims of crime, I don't think they think like that. In fact, they don't think like that. They want answers and they want their loved ones protected. As to finally, the risk that we talked about of having a backdoor. So let's go back to 2014. In September, Apple says it's now going to re-engineer its devices so they no longer can open them. So the question I had was, well, you must be doing this for a reason. There must have been some vulnerability in the way that you accessed information from the phones, or else you wouldn't be doing this. And indeed, Ken referred to it several times about the danger of having a backdoor. Well, I asked Apple, I flew out to Cupertino and spoke to Apple and to Google in 2015 spring. And I asked them the question, well, how many, before you made this shift, tell me how many instances there were where phones were compromised, as Ken alludes to, as a result of sending the phones out to be opened by Apple. If it was a problem, tell me how big a problem it is. And then now afterwards, now after you've done it, tell me how much better it is. Apple never answered my request or my letter, but ultimately at a hearing in which I testified, the House Judiciary Committee, they asked Apple this question. And it relates to iOS 7, which is the operating system that preceded iOS 8. iOS 7 in 2014 was a system that Apple could open pursuant to a court-ordered search warrant to get access to data. So the question by the committee was the technology you possessed to decrypt those phones ever compromised? That's the question. Using iOS 7, was the data ever compromised because of your ability to open the phones? Did someone come in and steal the data? And Apple's answer, finally, 3 years later, was this. The process Apple used to extract data from locked iPhones running iOS 7 or earlier operating systems was not, to our knowledge, ever compromised. So if that's true, if the doomsday scenario Ken presented, in fact, never happened, then you have to ask yourself this question. Was Apple responding to a security issue or a public relations problem? I don't think it was a security issue because we've now learned that there were no phones that Apple had that were compromised by this process of court-ordered search warrant and Apple opening the phones and getting the data. It was not a security risk. So let's consider that the world falling down description of Apple for using court-ordered search warrants to access phones. That strikes me when we look at their response as not accurate, not true. But here we are, 2.5 years later, talking about backdoors, which the government has never had, or compromises of data, which never occurred.
And Ken, of course, Cyrus said the amount of crimes that are committed, the ones that can be found, be prosecutions or solved because of this access through encryption. Is it an exaggeration, saying there's only a few, or would the access give a lot more evidence for prosecution?
Well, I mean, Cyrus talks about what was the current number, 533, is that what you said?
Our current number.
Current number, so he's got 533 phones sitting in his office. I don't know how many of those are actually going to have evidence. You've got a court order for those, but they may or may not be valuable. Your office prosecutes what, over 100,000 cases a year?
It prosecutes 100,000 cases a year, but the 533 are only devices that we have in our office, in our cyber lab. It does not. That's not the universe of cell phones which police take for evidence.
But my point is that we're talking about less than 1% of 1 year's worth of cases in this office. So this is, it's a limited problem, and we don't, even those 533. Probably a lot of them will have worthless evidence. So
how do you conclude that?
You don't know. Well, I do know it's less than 1%, right? 100%.
No,
533 is 0.533%.
No, it is 533 devices. Of those devices we take into our lab, it doesn't include the devices that the NYPD captures, which are many more.
But of the ones in your office, 100,000 cases, 533 devices. 533 over 3 years, 100,000 per year. So, okay, we can play the numbers out, but it's less than 1%. Now, in terms of, backdoor is a metaphor. So to say, the metaphor doesn't apply, we can argue this back and forth. What Cyrus is proposing is that you allow the companies a way to get back into your phone. Now, And it's not just one key that they can stash away in a good hiding place. It's a key for every single phone. And we've seen that even highly sophisticated companies are hackable. That's why the millions of Yahoo emails are out there. That's why RSA, the king of security, had their seed key hacked. The very thing that Cyrus says, we don't have to worry about. It's a different context. RSA is not Apple, but the analogy is there. They were hacked. If you look back at telephones and landlines, which were actually harder to hack because you had to get physically there, whereas once you create a vulnerability, it's much easier to get into it through the internet. But when we were back dealing with landlines, Greece was hacked to the point that they actually were listening to the prime minister's phone. So, the idea that, just have faith, everything will be fine, not the case. Even if you go back to Apple, they say, not to our knowledge were they hacked. But what we've learned is the most important hacks countries sit on because they want to apply them selectively. So the fact that Apple doesn't know, I take no great confidence in that. Plus, today, hackers are so much more sophisticated than they were just 3 years ago. We've got, entire buildings in St. Petersburg filled with hackers. We've got governments that are throwing thousands and thousands of people into hacking. They're getting to everything. John Podesta, through the last election. So I think we should not be introducing vulnerabilities. We should be doing everything we can to enhance our security. Yes, there will be a cost. There will be 533 cases potentially that can't be solved. But against that is the fact that there are, probably millions of cases of fraud that won't be pursued. There are millions of cell phone thefts that won't take place. And there is all of our privacy that will be much more protected than would be the case if this vulnerability were introduced.
We're going to start running out of time. I'd like to open up the floor for questions. So anyone out there with questions, you would like to raise your hand. I think there's some mics. There's some mics around. Yep. Okay. Any questions from the floor?
Over here, son.
Can you see one there?
Up there.
There's one up there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi.
Here we go.
This is working? You can hear me? Thanks so much. How do we utilize technology, wearable safety technology, to help protect people from human trafficking, sex trafficking? How do we integrate technology with fighting against this very terrible thing?
Ken?
Yeah. Well, again, as with all of this, there's a double edge to this. You can say that if you had complete access to all communications, that would be one way to go after traffickers. And undoubtedly, if prosecutors like Cyrus did have unfettered access, if privacy wasn't a concern, it'd be easier to make cases against traffickers. I tend to look at this a little bit differently, though. The progress that Human Rights Watch has made against trafficking has actually not been by prosecuting individual traffickers, important as that is. I don't want to denigrate that. But the big movements we've made has been through policy changes. By getting governments to give back the passport to a migrant domestic worker, by allowing an employee to shift employers to get past the so-called FALA system, so that if you have an abusive employer, you can go someplace else. To get a day off so that you can tell your friends that you're being abused. Those are, seemingly small but enormous policy shifts. How did we get that? By talking to the victims. And victims won't talk to us if we can't guarantee their confidentiality. If I can't guarantee that what we're writing down in this and communicating with each other stays private, they're not going to talk to us, and we're not going to make the policy changes that we need to make to fight trafficking.
Cyrus?
I agree with Ken wholeheartedly to this extent. I think our shift in law enforcement has very much been toward prevention models, not just prosecution of individual cases. Particularly in the cybercrime, I'm investing not nearly as much time as I put it differently. The amount of money that we are investing in prevention strategies is equal to or greater now than the amount of money we are investing in enforcement strategies. So I think that's the way forward, is to work with communities about how to protect themselves and to focus on prevention strategies. But I think it's important that we understand the relationship between criminals, their devices, and trafficking. So there's a gentleman who we were investigating for sex trafficking, and we could not get access to his iPhone. And because we could not get access to his iPhone, the charges that we could bring were lesser charges. He was charged with other crimes, and he ultimately pleaded guilty to other crimes. But what struck me was he was recorded on a phone call, Rikers Island, which is our city prison, and all calls in and out of Rikers are recorded. And there's a sign when you sit down on the phone saying this conversation is being recorded. He's speaking to his compatriot in his operation outside of Rikers Island. And what he says to his compatriot was, make sure we go out and get more of these iPhone iOS 8s, because the government cannot access the communication, and I'm quoting the gentleman now, he says, it's a gift from God. Now, that may sound a little dramatic, but this is a run-of-the-mill criminal dealing with serious crimes that relates to trafficking, and he knows that the technology that is now on the phones that prevents them from being accessed is his ticket to a successful criminal enterprise. So, in a little pushback to Ken, that's the world we're dealing with. These are not stupid people. When this technology is available, they know its power. If I, 20 years ago, when we were doing organized crime cases, could give to a mob boss a phone, and I'd say, no one will access this phone, ever, that would have been worth $2 million in the 1980s. It's unthinkable. But that's the power of full device disk encryption. And I only want access to the phone if a judge has determined that I've made enough proof that there's evidence on this phone. It's not me deciding, it's a judge. That's our system of justice. That's why we have judges.
Yeah, although I should say that I mean, the iPhone is a very convenient way to do this, but if I was back in iOS 7, I'd still get WhatsApp and Signal. They're easy ways to evade this.
Well, you're not going to solve every crime, certainly. But I'd like to not be precluded from solving the ones...
The dumber criminals, yeah. Fair enough.
The ones that are available.
Ken, you mentioned, of course, you're often a victim of hacking. You mentioned the sophistication of hackers now. How do you ensure that your communication is secure?
Well, I would never be so stupid as to say guarantee. But we make an effort. And what we have done now is every internal communication we have, we double encrypt. So we are actually on the Microsoft cloud, and we encrypt it before we give it to Microsoft. And that's just one way we deal with that. But we know that there are governments that are constantly trying to probe our system. And this is leaving aside our website, which is constantly attacked. But even our internal communications, governments want to know who our contacts are. Who are the people we're speaking with who are giving us this information about their dirty deeds so they can go after them. And there are certain offices, our Moscow office, we know that we probably can't guarantee our electronic communications, and there's certain things we don't communicate electronically. Sometimes you have to fall back on the old whisper, But we, take what precautions we can for things that are not life and death matters, and for things that really are life and death matters, we're careful about not using electronics.
Questions from the floor? So there's one here, yes.
Thank you. Having worked in human rights in Xinjiang, China with Uyghur people, and in Afghanistan, and now in child protective services in the States, I feel that tension of the two perspectives. And I'm wondering, for me, this seems like an issue of public and private space. And if for example, the examples you gave, if I were HIV positive or seeing a psychiatrist, that's information about me that I want protected, then shouldn't I, as a private citizen, take responsibility for more carefully guarding that information, especially in comparison to the value of putting a stop to the protected data of human traffickers, pedophiles, terrorists? Should we, as activists, have a social contract amongst ourselves to consider cell phones as public space rather than constantly vying for and spending resources on protecting a private space that, as you just alluded to, will really never be private.
I think it's to you.
All right. It's some people actually do respond the way you've suggested, and feel that there's no guarantee of privacy, and so you just got to assume that anything you write down, any phone call could be monitored, and that is one way to lead your life. The fact is, though, that in modern life, you can't really get by without these devices. I mean, everything in one way or the other goes through this, and so almost everybody has things they want to keep private. And there are limits to that. I mean, so, I'm not against, legitimate law enforcement orders, but you do have to balance that. And I think that we all recognize that, we don't want our life to be an open book. And, I dread the day that some hacker figures out how to get into this, because I'm sure I've been, careless in the way I've said things, in what I've communicated, and it'll be embarrassing. And I don't want to make that easier for the hackers. And I bet everybody in this room can think back to those emails that you wish you hadn't sent, and they're there, there's no erasing them. So we shouldn't be making it easier for that kind of stuff to happen. And it is, to some extent a balance, but as I want to just come back to this is the golden age of surveillance. I mean, there is so much more information, Cyrus, that you got than I had a couple decades ago.
But the criminals have too. So we all move forward at the same time. Yes, there's more data, but there's also more ways that the criminals can use cell devices, encrypted devices, in order to commit crime. So with regard to the question, I do think that there's no black and white answer on it. But I would say is that it's nothing new for the government to insist on modifications or rules with regard to technology. We talked about some of them earlier. But what I feel right now, what strikes me as wrong, is that Ken and I are having a debate about privacy and public safety. Now, that's fine, but this is being decided by two companies whose operating software runs 97% of the world's smartphone market. Two companies who are gajillionaires. And this is, make no mistake, this is about selling phones. That's their primary objective. And so what you've done is you've ceded to these two huge companies the ability or the responsibility to address the public safety reality that we need to address. And I just don't think that these two companies should get to decide where this balance lies between public safety and privacy. Because the way they've decided it to date lines up perfectly with their economic self-interest. And this is why I think that we need our legislators to come in and take the decision out of those who are motivated, certainly in part by profit, and put it in the context of a real debate where the interests of crime victims and cell companies and technology can be heard, and for the government, through its Congress, to make the decision here, not the companies themselves, because there's no regulation at all on this issue, period.
Yeah. But Cyrus, could I just, if I could, I don't think that's a fair characterization of what's going on. We are all deciding this because we all prefer our privacy. I mean, why are the companies all moving toward default end-to-end encryption? Because we want it in light of the Snowden disclosures who revealed that the government was like soaking up our information.
Of course we want it. But what we want doesn't necessarily give respect to the rights of a crime victim to have her case resolved, to have the prosecutor get access to all the evidence.
Yeah, but Congress, in a sense, because there's this huge public clamor for greater privacy protection, Congress isn't acting. I mean, they've had hearings.
Let's not look at Congress as the solution.
Well, you're saying legislation. I mean, in other words, if it's not the companies deciding, which is really us deciding, it's Congress deciding. But Congress is sensitive to public opinion and realizes that if they introduced a backdoor, the public would be in an uproar. And so they're not acting. They're saying we're accepting the status quo is what is the proper balance. So it's not just two companies deciding. We're deciding, all of us.
I think that's too glib. I think in reality, we are all deciding what's important for us. I want my privacy, just like you do. But I also want, in order to have a way to protect public safety from terrorism and from crimes against the person, I also want, in the bigger picture, someone to be looking out for that part of the society that we live in. Because I'm a selfish person, and I'm going to look out for what's good for me. So if I get to decide, even if it's 10 million of us, that still leaves victims of crime not having their interests respected.
You know, but
we're running out of time. One quick question from the floor, and then we'll have to cut it short. Thanks very much.
Hi. This question is mostly for Ken. So I work for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and a lot of the trends that we see, especially with minors, is that a lot of this trafficking is happening over technology. So how do you suppose that we continue this fight against sex trafficking of minors, which occurs over Kik and WhatsApp and all of these technologies, if we can't even use the technologies against the predators?
Well, first of all, I think as we're stressing, there are a lot of ways into communications. I mean, Cyrus is actually not even asking for, if I understand correctly, you want to be able to get to the phone. You're not even talking about decrypting the communication between phones.
Well, I think we should start with what's on the phone and then figure out the protocol for.
But no, my point is that there are many ways to make cases, and we're talking about one type of evidence, but there's testimonial evidence, there's search warrants, there are bugs in the room. There's physical surveillance. There's a lot of stuff, And we, just as we don't outlaw whispering, just as we don't outlaw shades, just as we don't allow torture, which might produce additional evidence, we've always put limits on the ways we can collect evidence. And so I recognize that those evidentiary limits do have costs in terms of the ability to make cases. But we accept those limits because there are countervailing interests here. And because our entire private lives are contained in those phones, I think the public, via the companies, via their market preferences that the companies are responding to, wants those limits on prosecutorial powers.
Okay, well, thank you very much, both of you. The fascinating discussion, we could go on for a lot longer than this. It's just the tip of the iceberg here, but thank you very much, Cyrus. Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you very much.